are various types of programs that go beyond the aerosol trails, or what people call the chemtrails. They're ship-based, we believe, disbursement of these aerosols, and they're responsible for huge weather systems being created out in the Pacific.
Something is going on, something so serious that the United States government will never, unless it is forced, to acknowledge that it is doing it.
Different particles have different effects, but the ones that people have talked about, if you inject them into clouds over the ocean, they would make the clouds brighter and also reflect more sunlight.
Even if you put 10 megatons a year of sulfur in, which is a huge number, by this model you only get about a watt, 0.7 of radiative forcing. Nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about alumina. It turns out, first of all, there's been a lot of work on the environmental consequences of alumina in the stratosphere. Alumina has 4 times the volumetric radiative forcing for small particles as does sulfur. And that means you have 4 times less surface area for the same radiative forcing. And this is a much bigger deal. You'd have roughly 16 times less the coagulation rate. And that's the thing that really drives removal. But nevertheless, the underlying concern, and the reason that this hasn't been talked about until the last few years, is this so-called moral hazard.
What we're finding in rain tests are the exact materials listed and named in a number of geoengineering patents, and also listed in a number of geoengineering models. Some of these rain tests, we've seen levels of aluminum, the primary ingredient described in a number of stratospheric aerosol geoengineering programs, escalate as high as 50,000 percentage points. So the numbers have just skyrocketed.
I did 3 analyses spread out over time, and on each occasion I had 80 milligrams per litre, which was quite high. Then I had 120 and the other one was 70. That was in line with the realisation that that was a lot of aluminium in the rain.
It was disturbing on Maui, where a lot of people in certain parts of the island get their water from water catchment tanks. We were measuring samples of the water and found high levels of aluminum, barium, and strontium. We then took those findings to the health department, and the health department conducted rain catchment tests. And what we found was the same average of aluminum, barium, and strontium in the rain catchment we found was the same we were finding in our tanks, that people were drinking and using that as their water source.
We're finding the same metals worldwide. I'm only working the local area, but everything I've seen, it's aluminum, barium, strontium.
The military is spraying another substance into the lower atmosphere. The academics don't mention this because most academics are funded by government grants. When coal is burned by utilities, it produces a heavy ash that settles out. A very fine powdered ash that used to go up the smokestack. But it's so toxic that regulations mandated that this fly ash be trapped on electrostatic precipitators. And coal fly ash is ideal because sprayed into the area where weather occurs, which is where jet planes fly, the fine particles are very much enriched in the toxic elements. Mercury, chromium, just a whole suite of them, 40 elements, aluminum being one. It's a toxic nightmare. And that is harmful for everybody, especially pregnant women, especially for children, especially for people who have compromised immune systems or respiratory systems. It's bad for the elderly.
On heavy spray days, a lot of people have noticed sinus problems, headache, irritability, nausea. Anytime you put an aerosol up into the sky, it's going to fall into the air that we breathe. Obviously, we're inhaling this with every breath. With that, it gets into our systems.
And we've seen diseases that have never been there, the cancers that are coming up day and day.
My name is David L. Lewis. I'm a research microbiologist, and I worked for the U.S. EPA's Office of Research and Development for over 31 years in blood tests for human beings, tissue tests. We're seeing the elevation over the last few decades of these metals in the human population, and the health consequences associated with that are very serious.
Respiratory mortality went from 6 down to number 3 in a 6-year period. We see issues like Alzheimer's, ADD, other aluminum-related illnesses that have gone through the roof literally since the full-scale deployment of these programs.
It's well known that very fine particles make people live shorter lives, birth weights are lower, cancer, autism is increased.
Particularly during the early developmental stages of a child, the neurological effects on the brain and its development is of grave concern, since the forms of aluminum that are being sprayed into the atmosphere can cross the blood-brain barrier and contact the brain directly and cause damage to the brain cells.
This is all, I think, is a result of change of environment, all these toxins that are being sprayed everywhere. It's like a mass genocide that is going on here. People are not prepared for this.
Innocent people among us, their health is being damaged, and that is, in my view, a crime against humanity.
There's something called aerotoxic syndrome. Now, I now have been speaking with doctors and with pilots. Many people are becoming ill. They're getting neurological conditions, they're getting extra fatigue, they're getting higher rate of cancer.
Commercial airlines fly pretty much at the same altitude or around where geoengineering programs are taking place. And those have much higher concentrations of aerosols. What they do, they pull in some air into the cabin from outside. So as a result, people are getting a higher concentration of these metals that are coming into the cabin. And we're seeing this issue of aerotoxicity. That's impacting frequent flyers, flight attendants, flight crews, pilots.
There are 2 pilots from British Airways, both aged 43, that died in 2012. This is due to aerotoxic syndrome. All the ailments of people who are now unable to fly because they are too ill to fly are consistent with heavy metal toxicity.
It's destroying our children's lungs. It's destroying our health. These are programs that are creating death.
Results of climate models indicate that reflection of sunlight away from the Earth can offset most climate change in most places most of the time. But it will damage some places.
It puts aluminum and other things in chemically mobile forms, soluble in water, so they can get into plants and to animals.
And by doing that, you're changing the whole chemical structure of fruits and vegetables and animals, and then you're eating toxic food. So the whole thing comes into that science of geoengineering.
You've got a tremendous rise in Alzheimer's, not just in humans, in bees. I mean, how can bees be suffering with high aluminium toxicity? Aluminium is ubiquitous, it's all around us, it's in the earth and everything else. It's never caused any problems before, but something has changed. But why should it suddenly start to affect the bees? Or even whales now have been found to have extremely high levels of aluminium toxicity affecting their health.
It's causing huge stress, manifesting itself in beetle invasions and in fungus invasions, and all of those are setting back our ecological patterns.
It's not normal. The environment is changing, the skies are changing.
We have a substance that is being literally poured in the air above us. Rainwater extracts aluminum, and so you have 2 effects from that. You have the aluminum poisoning of plants, and you have the soil pH being changed, typically making it more alkaline. This is a substance that harms virtually everything.
Everything is polluted now. You know, even the crops that we eat and then supposed to be organic, they're not organic. How do you control the skies? your organic soil is being polluted by what's going up there.
Aluminum makes up about 8% of the Earth's crust, but aluminum is strongly bound to oxygen and to the silicates, so it doesn't move around. And so all of life developed without ever it being exposed to aluminum that could move around. And we have no natural immunity to mobile aluminum, nor do plants.
We have tree decline in all areas, even areas that are getting an abundance of rain. Those areas are testing positive for the primary ingredients in geoengineering programs. These programs are about death and destruction. And why? What happens when our forests collapse? That's the lungs of our planet.
You can see impacts on all of the trees. There are just tons of dead branches scattered throughout the whole tree, which probably reduced its canopy in half, knocked its life expectancy down probably in half. That's what got me concerned when I was working for Fish and Wildlife, that it's affecting all of our trees that much, and the trees aren't going to live as long. If they're not living as long, and then the species that use them are also impacted.
This is very common now in the Chicago area. It's about every 3 or 4 trees that we're seeing is dead in this community. What we notice in Maui is about 1/3 of our rainforest is actually dead.
Geoengineering is changing our weather, and the explanation is that by changing your weather patterns, you're changing what's normal for all of the species that have evolved there.
So let's say we were doing geoengineering because we wanted to make the weather a little bit better. Then we'd be balancing some risky geoengineering against the benefits of making the weather a little better. And in my view, the right time to wait until we did that would be infinity.
Anytime you put an aerosol into the atmosphere, it's going to affect wind speeds. It's going to affect cloud nucleation. An interesting thing is geoengineers are talking about how, if these programs were to be initiated, which they have been, how they will have to utilize and implement weather control and determine where it rains, when it rains, and who specifically gets rain.
We're already beginning to see the formation of the center of circulation.
My name is Scott Stevens. I studied meteorology at the University of Kansas, and that was my first TV job was on the air was in Topeka, and then I worked in Omaha and Tulsa, Albany, New York, and then out into eastern Idaho in the Pocatello, Idaho Falls market for the last 10 years of my 20-year career doing weather. It wasn't until about 2005 when I got deep into the weather modification aspect of this story of geoengineering. One of the parts of the program that is very important, that plays into the chemtrails, is the precision of these actions in the atmosphere. These chemtrails are absolutely required, so they introduce the right energy at the right location for the right length of time. These trails are wires in the sky.
The combined technologies like HARP and the chemtrails were designed to work together as weather weapons.
HARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. It is filled with phased array antennas. They steer microwaves into the ionosphere where they will activate all of the ions up there.
They can use excitation waves that actually affect the metallic particles. So we've ionized the air column. They can heat it, they can cool it. HARP has directional antennas, and they can focus their antennas on where they want to move the jet stream, and they can hit the jet stream, and they create an artificial high.
If you accentuate the high, if you amplify a little bit, it's like building a mound of dirt, and you have a little creek or a little stream of water coming. You build the mound of dirt, that water's not going to go through it. So you build the mound, and then that's going to impact storms that are inbound. And so it's very easy to add those particulates of aluminum, barium, and whatever else they want to put in there. And as you add heat to that, those particulates then radiate the heat into the atmosphere, and it warms. And what does a warming atmosphere do? Boom, it expands. We see more intense droughts. We see rainfall rates of 1 to 2.25 inches an hour, and sometimes even rainfall, 1.25 inches a minute is just unheard of. And so when you get the atmosphere capable of conducting this kind of electricity, plus the engineers, you're going to end up with weather that is extreme, and that's putting it kindly.
When they move the jet stream, it then pushes up into the polar vortex. The polar vortex really can only move when there's something impacting it, like HARP.
They can heat up that ionosphere. So when the jet stream comes in, it hits that bubble and it diverts. The jet stream flow that is normal brings precipitation and brings the jet stream right into California. And then it brings storm systems with it, it brings rain.
The jet stream got pushed off of the coast of California. It dried us up and took all our moisture away and pushed the jet stream north, and when it hit the polar vortex, it then was ricocheted straight down the east coast.
What we've been getting, very warm, very dry conditions in California, but in terms of the Arctic and in the Midwest, it's swinging all of that moisture, all that cold air.
You can kill a storm in place. That's easy to do with HAARP. You'll see the texture and the structure of the storm just melt, and it will become just this diffuse, amorphous, featureless mess. And that was one of the big epiphanies I had in forecasting. Anticipating a winter storm coming through, you've got to set forecast out that night, and you're waiting for the snow to start. You're waiting for the snow to start, and you're waiting for the snow to start, and it just doesn't. And you go outside and you see a warming zone begin to show up on the satellite loops. The clouds literally just begin to warm, and then that collapses the potential of the storm to put down the moisture. It's done. It's shot.